Check this out.
What's that? The Todd wall.
Oh, it's a whole wall.
Of course. When I got out of high school, I didn't have a lot of options. I was not a good student, and so it was unlikely I was going on to higher education. The only thing I was really interested in was music and computers. I didn't have the wherewithal to enroll in a tech school to learn what in those days were just, world's stupidest computers. So I was lucky enough, there was a guy that I knew, and we planned to put a band together after I graduated from high school. I left home on my 18th birthday and wound up living at his parents' house while we tried to put a band together. And there was a music festival. The headliners were the Byrds. Then there was another band called the Shadows of Night. Then opening for them was a band called Woody's Truck Stop. And they were a white blues band, and there were a lot of those at the time. There was a phenomenon that I grew up with, in particular in the 60s, of a lot of white guys wanting to be blues guitar players or play in a blues band. And they were mostly English guys, and the reason why was because in cities like Liverpool, where they had merchant marine ships, they would go to the United States and they would dock in Mobile, Alabama, which are giant shipyards in Mobile, Alabama. And they get off the ship and they go to these little record stores and buy these very limited run blues records and take them back to Liverpool. And suddenly all the white kids in Liverpool want to be playing the blues. The archetypal band, I guess, would have been the Yardbirds, because they just produced guitar players like crazy. Original guitar player was Eric Clapton, then he was replaced by Jeff Beck, and then Jeff Beck was replaced by Jimmy Page. If you were a guitar player, these were like your gods. And so we listened to them all the time, and after this was happening, white kids in America suddenly discovered the blues, after the English kids did. And so a lot of white blues bands started forming, and one of them was called Woody's Truck Stop. And I knew about them beforehand because all through the end of my high school years, I was growing my hair long, and they were constantly sending me home for having too long hair. Eventually they gave up. I read an article in I think it was Time magazine, a little article, and a picture of a kid with long hair on, and a little telephone monitor, and he's there with his homework. And essentially a judge had ordered the school to provide a telephone link to the classroom rather than make him cut his hair. So he stayed at home, and I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. He beat the system. So I knew about this band, Woody's Truck Stop, but had never heard of it. And we were kind of impressed. They had a lot of energy, and they played songs we liked. So we decided to go see them when they played in Philadelphia at one of their regular gigs. It was a place called the Artist Hut, and it held about 100 people. And we went down to see them, and my friend was a trained drummer. He took a lot of lessons and knew all of everything. He was amazing to watch. So in between sets, I learned that they were using a temporary drummer, and they were looking for another drummer. So my friend said, "Okay, can I sit in on the next set?" And they said, "Sure." And he played like a demon, and then as soon as the set was over, they asked him to join the band. And he said, "Well, I got a friend over here who's a guitar player, and I'm not going to abandon him, so if you let him in the band too." And they said, "Oh, all right." So they made me the rhythm guitar player in the band, and it made the lineup, and the other rhythm guitar player, he moved up to being the harp player and the lead singer, so we had a lineup exactly like the Paul Butterfield Blues Band at that point. That's why they rationalized putting me in the band. But I did have one talent that the other guitar players and a few other guitar players had. I could play slide guitar. And it was a particular kind of style of slide guitar. Most slide guitar, you usually retune the guitar and you use a big long slide and play chords like that. When I got interested in playing slide guitar, I didn't know exactly what it was. They call it slide, they call it bottleneck, but I was looking for something that I could create that sound with. And a friend that I had also been living with in my senior years, his uncle worked for IBM and would give him boxes full of old parts. And computers in those days were more like what you would call data processing. You take a stack of cards and put it at one end of a card sorter, and then would like file all the cards out. But it was a mechanical process, and there were pulleys and belts and stuff inside. You know, these are computers, and they got pulleys and belts in them. So I found this little pulley about that wide, broke the flange, filed the flanges off of it, and that became my slide, and it covered exactly 3 strings. So I could do kind of like chordings without retuning the guitar. So that became my superpower, and I eventually became the guitar player that people came to see. Eventually the band broke up because inevitably bands break up. But I was in such a position at that point within the Philadelphia music scene that I could steal anybody from any other band that I wanted and form my own band. And that's what I did, and that's how the Nazz came about. Stole a drummer from one band, stole a singer from another band. The bass player was had been the bass player in Woody's Truck Stop, and he quit. It was like the summer of '66 or something like that, and the Grateful Dead released their first record, and everybody in the band decided they wanted to go to the country and take acid and write new music.
We don't prescribe to that.
Yeah. So it wasn't going to be a blues band anymore anyway. So he quit. And then we formed the Nazz, you know, a 4-piece. Mostly did covers, and we were playing in really unlikely places, just any place that would have us, and some regular venues, because we did have a reputation. But we didn't have a record deal, and we didn't have, well, we had sort of informal management. We were rehearsing over top of a record store on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, and the 2 guys who owned the record store decided they wanted to manage us, and they rented a house for us to stay in. So we're bumming around, and the Who come to town to play, and the Who are opening for the Mamas and Papas, if you can believe that. This is the Who, like the Who's first tour. It wasn't the first time I'd seen the Who. We'd seen the Who before. We saw the Who and Cream's American debut at a Murray the K show earlier, where they each got to play 2 songs. And the Who played Substitute in My Generation, and nobody had ever seen anything like that before. They did 2 or 3 shows a day over the course of a long weekend or something like that, and he smashed the guitar every show. You know, they went up, and even sometimes there would be enough guitar left that they would put it back together again so he could smash it again. But you know, the Who, that was just like unbelievable. Also, it was Cream's first American debut, and they were amazing as well. Although it was kind of strange because Eric Clapton had a big afro, like this big, you know? And I don't know whether it was a wig or whether he permed his hair, but he had a giant blonde afro. So anyway, the Who are playing in Philadelphia later, and the band goes to see them play, and then we hear that they're staying at the Holiday Inn downtown. So we say, well, let's go see if we can find somebody in the Who and talk to them. And we did find Roger Daltrey in the bar at the Holiday Inn downtown. And so me and the drummer are in there, and we're chatting them up. And we made a point of always dressing like we looked like we were in a band. And sure enough, we're chatting with Roger Daltrey, and a guy comes up to us and says, "You guys look like you're in a band." "Are you in a band?" We said, "Well, we do happen to be in a band." And it turns out he had been a successful publicist for like Columbia Records, and he was an independent publicist, but he decided he wanted to get into the management business, and he was looking for a young, cute band to manage. And so he says, "Well, I'd like to hear you." So the next day we demoed some songs for him. He brought his partner down from New York to listen to us, and then after we were done playing for him, he says, "I want to manage you." So he made a deal with the guys in the record store who were managing us, kind of bought us out, and took us away immediately to New York. And then after that was a process of starting to write original material, demoing material. In those days, most record labels had their own studios. And if you wanted to demo for the studio, you know, nobody had their own tape recorder. So you would go into the label's own studio, and they'd say, record as many songs as you can in a half an hour. And we would do that for all of the major labels. And eventually somebody bit, and it was pretty complicated because when we got signed, we were distributed by Atlantic. And this was in Ahmet Ertegun, Jerry Wexler days. This is when Atlantic was like the big They were mostly like soul music, black music, and that sort of thing. They did a couple other things, most notably Vanilla Fudge. But you'll have to go to the internet to find out all about that. He did make it to the Ed Sullivan Show, as I recall. And it's one of the hammiest things you've ever seen. I mean, the way they performed was just really weird. But, by the way, that was Carmen Appice's first band, Vanilla Fudge. So we eventually got signed, and we got a publishing deal as part of that as well. And they were going to put us on a label called Cold Gems because it involved Screen Gems and Columbia, distribution by Atlantic. But there was a band called the Monkees on Cold Gems, and we didn't want to be associated with the Monkees. So we kind of forced them to invent a new label out of nowhere, and they call it SGC Records. So instead of being Cold Gems, Columbia Screen Gems, it was Screen Gems Columbia. So we got our own label. We put out our first record, wanted radio to jump on our first single, which was A-side was a song called Open My Eyes, and the B-side was a very dirgy version of the very first song I ever wrote called Hello, It's Me. And radio did not respond to Open My Eyes so much, but they flipped the record over and started playing Hello, It's Me. By then we had already recorded a second album, which had yet to be released. And before the second album got released, tensions in the band got so bad, well, that I quit. So the original bass player quit, then I quit, then they found lookalikes to replace us, and that's when I got into engineering and record production. So that's a whole other story after that. But that's the first band that I was in, and the fateful way we got discovered. Just happened to dress the right way, happened to be in the right place at the right time. And that was kind of how we got our break. But I'm not saying it's possible or necessary to do that. But I think it couldn't hurt to dress like you're in a band all the time.
Kind of the foretelling of streaming and MP3. How did you see that coming? Or like, did you?
Well, another interesting story. I actually grew up before there were LPs. There were still lacquer 78s. My parents had albums for them. That's why we call them an album, even though it's one thing. They would go in something that looked like a photo album because there'd only be one song on each one. I remember when vinyl records first came out. My dad got so excited he built a hi-fi for himself. You know, it was just mono. And I remember going with him to places where they would sell audio equipment. And when stereo came out, you would go there just to hear the demos of like a train going by or something like that. The realism of the sound is starting to advance. The technology for capturing sound is getting better and better. Vinyl is essentially the only target that you have, I'd say between the early 60s or late 50s and the late 70s. So the format lasted about 20 years. And the format change was cassettes and 8-tracks, because this was the first time anybody could have a personal listening experience outside of their house. Because previous to that, you had to set up your turntable, you know, put the speakers in just the right place, and when you bought a record, you locked the door, you put the record on, sat in the sweet spot and listened to it all the way through. And then you might do that again. And almost nobody nowadays knows that experience. So the limitations, actually, of vinyl created an experience that was more complete than what most people get today, because most people don't stream an entire album. You know, they'll stream songs that they like off of the record. So you won't get that artist-directed experience. We get really torturous. You know, you torture yourself over the running order of the songs, the exact sequence, because you're creating a story. You know that people are going to listen to all of it. Nowadays, I don't know if that even matters anymore, but I still think that way. Anyway, the first portable format was like cassette tapes and the Walkman. Everybody had a Walkman at that point. And that changed the whole game, because everybody's doing something else besides listening to music. They're listening to music, but maybe they're jogging or cooking or exercising or something else. Music has some other utility besides just listening to it. Then that was eventually replaced by a few short-lived formats like mini disc and things like that. And then essentially CD-ROM took over. Once the industry started moving to CD-ROM, it eliminated a lot of the problems of vinyl. Vinyl has a lot of issues. It has audio quality issues, because at the outside of the disc, you've got about a yard of real estate with the sound in. By the time you get 6 inches into the disc, you've got half as much. So you're still trying to put just as much sound in half as much real estate. Vinyl was not the best way to capture sound, even though people say it's so warm. You know, of course, you know, by the second time you play it, it's covered in dust and this crackling and all this other stuff. So vinyl was destined to die in that sense, even though it's back now in the kind of collectors. You know, it's a collector thing. But you know, most of the people when they play the albums that they got at Urban Outfitter, they're also playing it on the portable stereo player they got at Urban Outfitters for $120. And so it's not like the old days where you had to set up a granite slab to put your turntable on, you know, and you'd buy the most expensive speakers you could afford and all of that. So obviously it's more about the music if it's about anything. It's not about the sound, it's about the music vinyl. So anyway, that got replaced by CD-ROMs, and then in the late 80s, early 90s, they had new interactive formats, CD-ROM or CDI, things like that, where you could put more than music on the disc. You could put pictures, you could put interactive navigational constructs and things like that. And got into that for a little while. They even had a format that would play both in a regular CD player and in a computer, so it was some mixed hybrid thing. None of those things actually lasted until the internet. One of those formats was called CDI. I got approached because I'm one of those guys who likes to experiment with stuff. I got approached about doing a CDI project, and Philips was the company that owned the patent on CDI, and they would pay for the project if I would do it. So I came up with an album concept called No World Order, and essentially it's a database of 2, 4, and 8 bar musical snippets that can be pasted together in any order. A system by which you could tell it how you wanted it to put those things together. And it was called No World Order. And it was the first real interactive music disc where you could, you know, set up filtering and navigate through that. You could even, there were like 5 versions of the record already built in for you to start with by 5 of the world's premier producers. There was Howell Wonder, there was Bob Clearmountain, there was Jerry Harrison. Because I did that, another thing that was happening was interactive television. Didn't exist yet, you know. It does exist now. You can order a pizza on your TV if you want. But in those days, it didn't exist. And a company called Time Warner Full Service Network decided to set up a test community in Boca Raton, Florida. And they had fiber into every house, fastest bandwidth available at the time. And the video was supposed to come down the fiber. It wasn't supposed to come down copper like it mostly did. They approached me and they said, we need an application so that people can have on-demand music services. You know, it's kind of like No World Order, but you got to have a, you know, much bigger database of music. And so we said, okay, we'll try that out. We designed a system, but we realized you can't make it work unless you got some music on a server somewhere, you know, music that can be electronically delivered. So the next step was to go to what was then the 5 major labels, to their special products division, and explain to them, you know, this whole idea of putting music on a server. It's only an experiment now, you know, we're just experimenting to see how people respond to interactive music services. Not a single label would consider it. Music on a server to them was equivalent to just like inviting people to bootleg, because their biggest problem at the time, or at least what they considered the biggest problem at the time, was Chinese bootlegging. And you recall that, you know, the whole industry was freaking out about this bootlegging thing and piracy in general. So they said, well, first of all, you know, we don't even know how to explain this to artist management so that they can sign off on it. Second of all, if we start putting music on servers, you know, our biggest musical outlets are like Walmart's, and they'll take all of our product off their shelves if they think we're going to deliver it directly to somebody. So nobody would put the music on the server. This is about 1 year before Napster. 1 year before Napster, and 3 years after Napster, the entire industry crumbles. Just completely crumbled. It's in the process of rebuilding now, but everything that they had like depended on just completely went away. And it's not as if labels disappeared, but suddenly they were kind of like, oh crap, you know, we had this opportunity and we completely squandered it, and we let other people take over. And eventually, I think it was probably Steve Jobs that solved the problem for him when he came up with the Apple Music Store. Then they could legitimately, get money for electronically delivered music. So it took that long for them to, it was at least a decade, of them trying to figure it out, but refusing to go along with it, insisting on still selling CDs and stuff, but never any electronic delivery. And of course, nowadays, it's just, you don't buy CDs anymore. No, you just get it electronically delivered. Or if you're a collector, you buy vinyl. That's kind of how the story of streaming, how we got from this intransigence of the music companies, essentially a global, wide open music market, where you can find artists from other countries, artists who don't have labels. Things you would never hear under the old system, because there were so many things that you had to do to get a record released.
So my question is like the ground up, like a song all the way to like the production of it, like mixing in the studio and all that.
Well, I've done kind of every different kind of situation between the records that I produced and the records that I'd made. It was remarkable, I suppose, at the time, to have somebody play all the instruments on their album, whatever the technical challenges might have been, and they were not inconsiderable. I, for instance, discovered that I had to start with the drums. Now, we didn't have MIDI then either. You couldn't just set up a steady beat. You had to play along to a click track or something. So I tried at first starting with the piano, because that would give me a reference about where I was in the song. But I tried to play along with it, and my piano playing was too erratic, from a time standpoint, to play along with. So I realized, if you're going to do this, you're going to have to play the drums. So I have to sing the song in my head while I'm playing the drums. And I did several albums like that. And then I've done, albums with a mixture of things. You might start with something that was built using drum machines and synthesizers, and then expand on that with live instruments. Through the 80s, it wasn't just MIDI, and the fact that MIDI kind of made everything a little too slick. There was no sort of feel to things. You could synthesize a feel if you wanted to, but MIDI normally would sound very precise and clockwork, when it was the basis of New Age music in those days. But the process throughout the 80s became, and I don't know how this happened, I wasn't a practitioner. Take a record like the first Cars record, which was a gigantic hit. But the guy who produced them, Roy Thomas Baker, took a year to do it. They thought they would never finish the record, because they go in and spend a whole day just trying to get a rhythm guitar sound, not play anything. And then once they got the sound, they would just lay the rhythm guitar down. So the band rarely played together when they were in the studio. They weren't playing necessarily to MIDI tracks. They didn't know what they had until the very last person put their overdub on, as opposed to everybody playing live. And I came to this realization, so in the end of the 80s, I did 2 records that were completely live in the studio, no overdubs at all. And sometimes it was a relatively small group of musicians, and sometimes it would be like 20, 30 musicians. And I have to say, it's from a recording standpoint, it's the experience you're looking for. Because at a certain point, you realize you're listening to the record while you're doing it. I'm listening to my record, I'm singing my record, but I'm hearing everything that's going to be on my record. And it's an experience that kind of hard to duplicate, because it's expensive to do live sessions that way, to hire everybody, pay them union scale, pay the studio costs, get a studio that's big enough, for instance, to be able to mic everything if you're going to have strings and horns and percussion and everything else in the studio. So, as I say, I've done it both ways. I find satisfaction in doing it both ways. When I do it my own way, the peculiar thing about it is I do all of the instrumental work first. I don't sing anything until I think the track is finished, because the track inspires the lyrics for me. I'm working on it subconsciously the whole time. I'm thinking about it, but I'm not actually writing it down. And I find that when it comes time to come up with the lyrics and sing it, I can write it in like 20 minutes.
Wow.
It's just like automatic writing, it's just coming out of my hand. Because I've let my subconscious do all of the work, pretty much most of the work for me. There's rewards in both kinds, in different kinds of approaches to how you make your music may be the most instantly rewarding. You know, to be able to go in there with other players and hear the whole thing all together.
How did you go about producing other artists? What was your method in the studio?
I got into production because at the end of the Nazz's career, well, after the first album, we didn't like how the mix turned out, so I decided, well, I'll just remix it myself because I was watching what the engineers did. I didn't touch the console very much, but I got some idea what I was doing, and I learned a lot the very first time I did that. The very first time you get a chance to touch, you know, the equalizers and hear what they do when you turn the knobs and that sort of thing. So I picked up a lot and decided during the course of that, I'm going to be the producer of our next album too. So I ordered everybody around all in the studio all the time, and that's another reason why the band broke up. But by that time, you know, I was in there actually while we're doing the basic recording, messing with the console a little. And when I left the Nazz, and I was kind of on the street at that point, I was living with clothiers in the West Village in New York. And the partner of the Nazz's manager, he had left and gone to work for Albert Grossman. I think I explained Albert Grossman was a manager, and he managed at the time Bob Dylan and all of the folk acts of the early 60s. He was one of the world's most successful managers. And his stable of artists was getting older, and they needed somebody young to put a new perspective on the recording process. And so that's why they looked me up. And the very first project they put me on was produced by Robbie Robertson of the band. It was an artist named Jesse Winchester, who was an American expat. There was Vietnam drafts going on at the time, and he left the country to avoid going to Vietnam. And I engineered that record, and they were so impressed with what I did that they made me the engineer on Stage Fright, which was their next record. And at the time, the biggest act in the world was the band. And so here I was, suddenly my second project, and I'm working with the biggest act in the world. And they're flying me all around, you know, they flew me to England so I could help them mix their concert at Albert Hall. And after that, you know, they started throwing me more stuff, and I would just take it on and somehow transform it into what they imagined it should be. But at first, I was very young. You know, just like 20 or 21, something like that. I was very impatient, and I was smart alecky. I'd have to, you know, particularly when we were doing the Stage Fright album, I'd have to get slapped down every once in a while. And in my early projects, I didn't realize, because I was so immature, the role of psychology and politics and the other things that go into keeping a band together or getting through a project with a band. Because often, you know, the act will come in and they're going to bring problems that have nothing to do with the making of the record into the studio. A couple of the guys are feuding with each other, you know, and it doesn't matter where they are, they always feud with each other. So you're trying to deal with that while you're trying to get them to make music at the same time. And those are kind of the skills that you eventually have to develop if you want to be able to deal with a broad number of acts. Some are really easy. Some acts are just incredibly easy to work with. Next Position Please with Cheap Trick was just fun the whole time. You know, we had nothing but fun. And most notably, Skylarking with XTC was a nearly suicidal exercise, you know, because one guy in the band really never wanted a producer. You know, and you're fighting against this the whole time. But record labels demanding that he listen to you, and he doesn't want to. So you'll find yourself in all kinds of situations if you're a producer that doesn't focus on a particular genre. It might be easier if you focus on a particular genre. You just want to be a metal producer, so all you got to do is figure out how to make everything sound really big. And then, you know, put lots of reverb on everything, like you're in an arena. Then again, you know, you want to do like a folk act or something like that, you got to figure out, you know, you've got to get all of that sweetness out of that acoustic guitar. A lot of different challenges sonically, depending on, you know, how many different kinds of genres you want to work with. But I was never a genre artist. I always try, philosophically, I try and do for the band whatever, I try and give them whatever's missing. And sometimes they have all of it. And all I'm doing is just, you know, managing the process a little bit, and it doesn't take a whole lot of creativity out of me. But then sometimes, you know, they got a song, and I'm sure some of you have written songs, you've tried to write a song, And usually what happens is you got a great idea to start from. You know, it might be a chorus or something like that, some hooky idea. And you write that down and you say, okay, I got to write a couple verses. You write a couple verses and then you realize, okay, like normal pop song structure, it's got a bridge. So I got to write a bridge. And this is usually the weakest part of the whole song, you know, as people say, because they got to do it. You know, it's like you wrote the stuff you wanted to write, but you got to write the bridge. And so sometimes just people get lazy with the lyrics and things like that, and that's when I have to say to them, you know, you need to put a little more work into this particular part of the song. And then there were early on there would be instances where a band would come in and we'd realize at some point in the project they didn't have enough music to finish the whole record. You know, they had other songs, but they weren't worth recording. So pre-production became more and more important to me as time went on. I want to hear the songs, you know. I want to hear what songs you intend to record. Do them in any kind of crappy demo form you want. But I don't want to go in the studio and suddenly find halfway through the project that we're sitting there with our thumbs up our asses because we don't have anything to record. And my other philosophical thing about the studio is essentially that, you know. Come into the studio ready to make music, you know. If there's other stuff that you want to do, like have a fight with one of your bandmates or something like that, do it outside the studio. When you come into the studio, don't waste the opportunity. And another thing that I think is a very important thing from a production standpoint, it's always better if the band has played the material live before they bring it into the studio. Or that the act, if it's a solo act, that they played it live before they bring it into the studio, because by then they know how it's supposed to sound. But if they're hearing it for the first time in the studio, coming back to the playback speakers, you know, especially the singers, you know, you're singing lyrics for the first time, you know, and you're too worried about keeping track of the lyrics and getting the words right, that the meaning of the words kind of takes a backseat to everything. So you want to have those words already internalized so that you can focus on the meaning of what the feeling, you know, whatever it is, the overall message you're trying to convey. You're not trying to remember the words, you know. You know the words. Now all you have to do is worry about selling them.
I know you're still very prolific, you're still recording, you still release the music. What's your process like now?
Well, I described it. It's even more the subconscious thing than it ever was. Partly because I live on the island of Kauai now. And I can suddenly get an idea for a song and call everybody up and say, come on over in a couple hours, you know, and we'll get this down on tape or get this down on disc. So it means that for the most part, I do have to record by myself unless I want to do a project where I write everything beforehand and give it to everyone to learn. And then I found that I can't write when I'm on the road. You know, I need a certain amount of kind of quiet. It used to be when I would do a solo record, and I still have my studio up in upstate New York. After we had moved from there, we moved to Hawaii, but I still had the studio up there. And I would go up there by myself and only have vague ideas of what I was going to do, but magically 2 weeks later there would be a record. And it was the isolation that enabled it to happen. You know, I talked about the subconscious a lot. There's so much ambient noise in the normal daily life that you're never going to get in contact with that, you know, until you go to sleep, until there's no other input happening, you know. And I discovered that if I want to use that as a principal part of the process, I have to get someplace quiet without distractions, where I can just, and sometimes if you were to see me in that situation, I remember when I was doing an album called Liars, I had to rent another house. I rented a little vacation cottage somewhere so I could get out of my house. And I would go there with my computer and stuff because I was composing everything using MIDI sequencer. And you might look through the window and I'd just be there playing solitaire on the computer because I'm just waiting for my subconscious mind to say, hey, I got an idea, you know? And much of that probably has to do with my brain wiring anyway. You know, when I was growing up, they didn't know what ADD was, learning disabilities. I just, you know, I was acting out. That was it, you know. And I didn't learn how to learn until I got out of school and realized that I have to multitask. I can't focus on one thing for more than 5 minutes. If I start focusing on that one thing, my mind starts to wander to other things and I'm less effective. So I have to have several things I'm doing at once. That's why I'm playing cards, you know. I can't force it to come out, you know, it's got to come out in some sort of organic way. And if I sit there and try and force it to come out, then that 5 minutes is up. And I'm just, you know, I'm wasting my time. I find for me, but it isn't necessarily true for everybody, but I find for me, you know, to multitask is what I need to do. Often in my productions, some of the artists will complain, he's sitting there reading or doing crossword puzzles while we're doing. No, I'm reading and doing crossword puzzles, and I'm listening at the same time, because that's what I can do. You know, I can do that. Maybe not everybody can do that, but I can do that kind of multitasking. And it's better that I do that than I sit there and suddenly start boring over after the 5th take of the song, you know? Then you don't have any objectivity anymore, and you can't really tell, and you can't make any suggestions to move the progress along. So that's what keeps me from getting, you know, numb to what's happening, you know, like little milliseconds of concentration spread around between different things.
Did you discover that early on in your career, or did you have to learn that over the years?
I discovered it well, I started doing it. You know, I didn't realize I was doing it. And then I realized the reason why I was doing it was because that was the only way I could maintain focus for any sustained period of time, was to not go past that kind of, you know, that the numb zone, you know. So, yeah, it was just a thing that I discovered. You know, I taught myself computer programming of the most gnarly kind, 6502 assembler language, you know, in the late 70s. And that was because I could, you know, I was never stupid, but I approached that the same way I approach everything else. I would code for a while, stuff like that. I come up against a wall. I can't figure this out. Go to bed and wake up in the middle of the night. My subconscious has done it again, figured it out for me, you know. It's like my AI is in there, but it doesn't figure out how to prompt it, you know.
Yeah, a couple times he was waking in the middle of the night. Don't talk to me, don't talk to me. That's a great idea. Don't talk to me. I'm going to go down right down. I said, don't talk to me. He'll just go downstairs for hours.
I know you've been working on a new platform, a new online platform.
Yeah.
Musician. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because this is your audience.
Okay. Well, roll back the clock to the 90s when the internet is just starting to be a thing. And I'm attending a lot of tech conferences. And one of them was specifically about monetizing the internet, because there were no e-commerce standards at that point. You know, nobody took credit card numbers. As a matter of fact, there was only one browser at the time, Netscape. And so there was some interest, you know, in how people might capitalize off of the internet. And I was listening to a bunch of the other speakers, and I thought about my own situation. And when you have a record deal, essentially the label's like a bank. They loan you the money to make your record, or they spend the money to promote the record, whatever, and they recover all those costs from your fans before you get to see any money, any new money. They advance you money to make the record, but you know, if you're going to see any money after that, they're going to collect everything until that's paid off. And I thought, well, maybe this new medium is a way for me to connect directly with my fans, and then they become the bank. They subscribe to me, and that gives me the funds to create new work, and then I deliver it directly to them. And I spoke about this, you know, I said, here's this idea I got, because I didn't come into the conference knowing what I was going to talk about. And as soon as it came out of my mouth, I thought, oh crap, you know, somebody's going to take this idea and do it. I better do it now. And so I announced this new service called Patronet, which essentially was allow artists to build services that their fans could subscribe to, and build a platform that would allow them to use video and animations and all of the kind of media that you can move electronically. Unfortunately, and I did get it off the ground. For about a year, it was fairly functional. I charged only $40 for a year subscription, and I got about 5,000 subscribers. So that was about $200,000, and that's a healthy album budget. So, and a living budget as well. You can live off that. And and make a record. But the problem was I didn't form a company or a corporation to run it. I was doing customer service, I was doing the coding, tech support, everything. I had no time to make music. So the whole thing just kind of wound down and collapsed after about a year or so. In the interim, other people did think, oh, that's an idea we could run with. So Spotify, Patreon, all of these other services started to come up with the same subscription idea, subscribing to creators. So when COVID came around, and every once in a while I would think, oh, maybe I could, do this again, and I would experiment with some new technology and hit a wall, realize I was spiraling into the same place again that I'd wound up before. So when COVID hit, I thought, well, this is what this should be made for. This is what it's for. When you can't tour or anything else, but you have a direct connection to your fans, then you can still communicate with them, sustain that relationship through this long period where you won't be able to share any space with them. And this time I did it the smartest way I could think of, and I got a lot of expert people, financial people and stuff, presented the idea and said, is this a thing that needs to be done? And they agreed it does need to be done because artists are still not getting what they need out of the existing service. You're either in a kind of a creative cubbyhole. In other words, you're just filling out a form and dumping your media into it and stuff like that. Sometimes, like for instance, YouTube. Everything is hits on YouTube, and if you get enough hits, then they'll put advertising on your channel or whatever it is that you're doing. But you don't get to pick the advertising. They're going to pick what gets advertised on your space. And at the same time, you're not really making that much money. You're supposed to get a split of the advertising income that comes from that, but you're not really making as much money as, for instance, the host is making, as much money as YouTube is making. The other problem is that if this is your only means of delivery, you're competing with so-called influencers. You're trying to write a song, that'll get 1 million hits, while someone else is eating a teaspoonful of cinnamon and getting 1 million hits. And so it's like you're a little bit of a disadvantage there, with that thing. There is a wild west of the internet, and all of that. And then there is the actual meat, the delivery medium, the pipe. And I decided, I don't want to do it the way other people did. I want to use the pipe, but I don't necessarily want it to be just another website. So even though you can observe whatever you subscribe to on the web, because we have a web player, it's optimally experienced on our application. And the application, you can pretty much do anything with it. And that sounds like a brag, but I've gone to some lengths to try and put things that have actually disappeared from other parts of the internet. In other words, our app can play MIDI. You can't find MIDI anywhere else on the internet, or you find it in spotty little places where you have to wait for them to download an instrument set to do it. Instrument set built into the application. So if you want to write something that sounds good in a GM format, you can just send the MIDI, which is very tiny. You can build 3D worlds with it. The site that you want to go to if you want to find out more about it is called Global Nation TV, because our paradigm is TV. It is not the web. What you'll be looking at is like an HD TV format screen, 1920 by 1080, just as if it was a game console. And in a sense, it's like a game engine running inside this application. And you just have to think like a game programmer when you're building your presence there. And takes care of all of the commerce stuff and everything. I've chosen to do some kind of literal representations of places that might be in a house, a fictitious house that I had. There's a recording studio, there's a home theater, there's a library, there's a tiki bar in there as well, where people can go and hang out and chat with each other and play karaoke music, my own music, but with the vocals removed, so they can sing along at home. The limitation is only pretty much what you can imagine. And it is free. And even if you're not trying to make money off of it, you can create things and share them with your friends. But the thing you have to remember is globalnation.tv. And if at some point you think you want to create something of your own there, we'll try and get you started.